Hello, English students. Welcome to your quick lesson on thesis statements. This time, I'm going to talk to you quite specifically about how to use formulas to create consistent, analytical, and argumentative thesis statements for your essays. A thesis statement is a necessary part of every essay you write at college. If your thesis statement is vague, difficult to find, or unclear, your reader, your instructor, is going to have a hard time following the ideas in your essay. And you never want your reader to have a hard time following your ideas. The thesis statement appears in the introduction and is the statement that provides the roadmap for the argument that follows. So you can see that without having a strong thesis statement in that introduction, without having that roadmap, your reader isn't going to be able to find things like topic sentences and key words that will reflect your argument and reflect the point of the entire paper. The first thing you need to be sure of is that you've completed all of your pre-writing before you sit down to start building an outline and building a thesis statement. So you need to make sure that you've done any required reading, you've read the novel or you've read the article, you've done any related research, you've gone into the databases, not just Google, and that you've done some free writing on the topic. It's important to start with some free writing, some brainstorming, get all those ideas out on pen or using pen and paper so that you can sift through them later and find those ideas that will create an ideal thesis and groups of ideas that you can write more on. If you find through the course of free writing, through writing your thesis, through creating your outline, that you need to do more research and you need to do more reading, always stop and do that. The other thing you need to know before you begin writing your thesis, or even really before beginning research processes, is to figure out what kind of essay you're writing. It should be very clear in the instructions given to you by your instructor what the aim or what the goal of the essay is. Are you explaining something or describing something? That's typically an expository essay. Sometimes it's also called an informational essay. If you're ever unclear on what type of essay, please always ask. Analytical papers typically happen in English class. They're the kind of essay where you're asked to analyze how a writer uses a particular literary device or symbolism in order to make the point or the tone of the piece clear to the reader. So if you're asked to analyze a particular aspect of a topic or a novel, that's asking you also to come up with an opinion. So analytical papers are asking you for your perspective on a particular issue. Argumentative papers ask you to look at both sides of an issue or the multiple sides of an issue and come to some kind of conclusion about them. There's also comparative papers, and usually comparative papers are fairly straightforward in that they'll say, compare these things. Now, the kind of formula you're going to use is going to depend on the kind of essay you're writing. You'll know that if you have an expository paper or an informational paper, your formula is going to be fairly basic. S consists of 1, 2, and 3. This is made up of these 3 things. You're simply describing or explaining. A, B, and C, so X is typically used for analytical papers, sometimes argumentative. And although, nevertheless, and because is typically used for argumentative and comparative papers. Formulas are really useful because they give you a framework to plug your ideas into until they sound the way you want them to sound. So if your task, for example, is to write a paper about cats as pets, you're given, okay, write about cats. Okay, I can write about cats. So I'm writing an expository essay. I'm going to grab the formula S consists of 1, 2, and 3, and I'm going to go through my free writing to see all the research that I did on cats as pets. What 3 categories do I want to talk about? Well, they're small, they're easy to care for, and they're quiet. For an expository paper, you're just explaining the function of cats as pets. You're not proving or arguing anything. Now, you might be asking yourself, why 3? Well, of course, most papers have 3 paragraphs. Sometimes there's more. You might have S consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or you might just have S consists of 1 and 2, if it's a particularly short paper. Similarly, if you're writing an analytical paper, you might not have 2 groups of topics to talk about. You might have 5, you might have 6, you might have 1. It's up to you, and it's up to the assignment instructions to give you that kind of direction. There are sometimes essays that will only have 1 body paragraph, and typically these are fairly short. Analytical papers use X because A, B, and C, or A, B, and C, so X, as a formula typically. Your X in this particular case is your main point, the ultimate thing that you are trying to prove to your reader that you are correct about. So X is always the big old main point. In the example on the screen, cats are the ideal pet for everyone, especially for the elderly, because they are comforting, self-managing, and unoffending to emergency medical personnel. In this particular thesis statement, X is cats are the ideal pet for everyone, but especially for the elderly. So they are showing or demonstrating that their main point is that cats are the answer to it all. Why are they the answer to it all? Because they're comforting, self-managing, and unoffending. So ultimately, you've analyzed cats as pets and fit them to the elderly people as an ideal. Now, comparing and arguing papers are very, very similar. Your instructor in the assignment description will ask you to compare or argue something, and they'll usually use the words compare or argue for in the assignment description, so you'll know right away. In the example on the screen, they're using although, nevertheless, and because. Or this is also called and boo, or although, nevertheless, because, ultimately. Because you're still having that main point, that ultimate X, that ultimate thing that you are going to prove. Stylistically, some very experienced writers will sometimes leave that ultimately bit for their conclusion. Generally speaking, though, in first-year college papers, your instructors aren't necessarily looking for it there. They'll be looking to see it in their introduction. And if they don't see it in the introduction, they really need to find it in that conclusion. So if you're a new writer and you're new to thesis statements, give the ultimately in the introduction, and just you save your recap for the conclusion. In this example, although dogs and goats are good pets for the rural elderly, nevertheless, most elderly people live or will live in urban environments. Consequently, cats make the best pets for the elderly because they live happily in small spaces, manage their own coat care, and deal well in emergency situations. So you can see we have an although, and in that first section of the paper, we're going to talk about dogs and goats and how they might make good pets for the elderly. There could be things that have to do with living in the rural area, right? So rural pets. Nevertheless, most elderly people live or will live in urban environments. That section of the paper is going to talk about the numbers of elderly people that live in cities and the constraints that they have in their lifestyles before going on to talking about how cats fit into that lifestyle. So cats make the best pets for the elderly because they live happily in small spaces. That will be a paragraph. They manage their own coat care. That will be a paragraph. And they deal well in emergency situations. That will be another paragraph. So you can see when you're comparing or arguing, your papers do tend to be quite a bit longer. Using the formula itself is fairly straightforward. You're just going to sit with a pen and a piece of paper. Ideally, I always recommend doing it on paper first. Write up the formula at the top of the page, and then just keep playing with the ideas that you have in your free writing. Circle and group together the ideas that you've accumulated to see if you can make 3 topics, 2 topics, or 4 topics. Then start plugging it into the formula. Plug the groups into the formula over and over again until it makes sense to you. Then check for word choice. Have I chosen the best words? Do I want to use these words throughout my paper to tie together the ideas? Do this until it sounds right, and make sure the ideas are parallel in their construction. Are you using the correct verb forms to make it sound smooth? Please watch the video on parallel construction found in the green Thesis Statements booklet on the Moodle page if you're at all concerned about parallel construction. Keep in mind that your thesis is not usually your entire introduction, but sometimes it can be for very long papers. It simply just depends. Typically you have an opening statement and a linking sentence before and after the thesis, and if you're writing a paper for an English course, then you might need to also introduce the novel and the date, and so on. Unless a descriptive or an expository paper is requested, instructors usually like to see that you've really thought through the issues and can come up with some sort of analysis or argument. So don't shy away from strong statements in your introductions. And keep in mind also that you must order the ideas in your thesis in the same order as your essay. This makes sure your ideas logically progress. And logical progression is important in a paper. Let's end this recording with an example. This is an example of an introduction from an English 106 paper on Pride and Prejudice. Manners are important for establishing an individual's status within communities. Even today, we identify each other's personal qualities based on appearance, manners, and speech. In Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the characters enact these same characteristics in a time period wherein manners were more than status, they were morals. Pride and Prejudice is a novel of manners because Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy each display opposing natures, differences in manners, and overcome their apparent differences in character through marriage. The two characters must first overcome these initial differences. So if we're going to take apart this introduction to find the thesis, we can see here, number 1, this is our opening general statement. The person is introducing the ideas that are going to provide the backdrop of the entire paper. It's usually fairly general, but not too general. Following that, they introduce the novel and specific topic. In this case, it's How is Pride and Prejudice a Novel of Manners? Then they get to the thesis statement. In this case, it's an X because A, B, and C thesis statement. We can see them answering the question, Pride and Prejudice is a novel of manners. Okay, yes, X, because Elizabeth Bennet, these two characters have opposing natures, they have differences in manners, and they overcome these differences through marriage. So I know that when I look below in the essay that follows, I'm going to see a paragraph on their opposing natures, I'm going to see a section on their differences in manners, and I'm going to see a section on their differences in character. The last sentence is a linking sentence to the very first idea. So the very first body paragraph is going to be about these initial differences.